1 this morning. My plan is to cover verses 18 to 32. Verses 18 to 32. And as I mentioned last week, this section of Romans is going to get us into the sensitive topic of homosexual interest. And so we're going to be talking about that this morning. I'm going to ask a favor of the group, okay? And that is to simply let me present on the topic this morning to make sure that I can cover it in a thorough way. I'm going to be focusing especially on what the Bible and St. Paul in particular are saying about the topic. And rather than have our usual dialogue, questions back and forth, I think it'll be a smoother and a quieter presentation if you just let me talk today about this particular topic. One of the things you may have noticed is that I have never preached a sermon on that topic here at Emmanuel. You've never heard me preach on it. And the reason is because of its sensitive character. It's something I always talk about in catechism classes because it naturally comes up in the study of the catechism and the commandments. But it's not something that I have dwelt on from the pulpit. Even before I came to Emmanuel. When I talk with people who are asking questions or wrestling about those questions of their sexuality, I find it's much better to speak with them in private counsel than to try to address those issues in a public forum like the pulpit. So that is the practice that I have exercised as your pastor, and what I intend to do going forward as well.
For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, both the truth and unrighteousness.
Okay, so what we're seeing here is that this passage, verses 18 to 32 in Romans, is not about, well, the one topic that it's really about is unrighteousness as a whole, human unrighteousness. And notice what it says there, God's wrath against all unrighteousness. So it's actually a broad presentation here that the apostle is giving on the topic of unrighteousness. It's important for us to see that. And also the wrath of God against unrighteousness. He notes there at the end of verse 18 that human beings, by their unrighteousness, suppress the truth. They suppress the truth. That's the truth as God has revealed it, the truth as we discover it and see it in God's creation. So that is what Paul is focused on. Now verses 19 and 20. If someone would read for us.
Because that which may be known of God is manifested in them, for God has shewed them unto them. For the invisible things of him, for the creation of the world, are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse.
Okay, so what St. Paul is telling us here is that we can know about God through his creation. We understand and know the nature of our God to some extent through his creation. He talks about his invisible attributes, and two in particular he mentions here: his eternal power, manifested in the way that the creation is put together, and also his divine nature. What God is like, who he is, what he does, how he is going to be working in our lives. These are two things that we can know and see from looking at the creation. Now, the Bible will also go on to say that we can't know everything about God through the creation. There are many things we don't get to understand For example, the fact that God is triune, that we know him as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. That's not revealed in the creation. It's something that we learn about him as God reveals himself to us. But here, the apostle is focused on what we can know about God through his creation and his created order. Okay? Let's see. We talk about a title that we use for this sort of a thing is called the natural knowledge of God. The natural knowledge of God. And I'm going to underline that word natural because that's going to come up as we proceed in the presentation here. Someone read for us verse 21 now in the passage.
For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened.
Okay, so he's talking about the consequences of the fall into sin. They know about God, they know he's there. They had the testimony of people like Adam and Eve from the beginning. Religion has been a part of human existence from the start and was passed on. But what happens to religious practice over time is that it gets corrupted. And what they know about God and what they can clearly see about God in his creation, what they should have known from the testimony of Adam and Eve, that's all getting distorted over time. And we see this in the various religions that spring up after that fall into sin. Verse 21, although they knew God, they did not honor him as God. In other words, they weren't recognizing him for his eternal power and creative work. But they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. So he's focusing us in on the problem of what we call original sin. Original sin. In other words, there's something fundamentally wrong with human beings since our fall into sin. The way we think, the way we perceive, the way we behave has all been twisted by that fall into sin. And he's now going to start giving us some examples of how this has gone wrong and gone awry. And the first thing he talks about there is in verse 22, if someone would read that for us.
Claiming to be wise, they became fools.
Okay, that was a short one. Read verse 23. Read verse 23 as well.
And exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things.
Okay, so here is St. Paul. He's giving us an example of this problem and how this is corrupting what people should see in the natural order and the ways of God. Sin is corrupting the heart. First of all, he says they claim to be wise, but they became fools. They seem insightful, but their insights are leading them astray. He goes on, they exchanged the glory of the immortal God, okay, that high power and attributes of God, they exchanged that for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. You think about the issues of idolatry in the ancient world. We're not so much affected by it here in the United States, but they were especially affected by that in the region where the Bible was written. You had the Canaanites and the Egyptians, the Moabites, the other surrounding Edomites, the other surrounding nations, and they all had many, many gods. And when they portrayed these gods for the sake of their worship, The natural thing that they chose was images that looked like human beings. Or even if you go down into Egypt, this is especially prominent, every manner of animal gets turned into a god down in that part of the world. And they begin, beginning with this, the divine nature of God and eternal knowledge of God, they go down and become worshipers of what is mortal. In other words, things that can die and pass away and disappear, things that are not at all eternal. This is how deep the corruption in the human mind and the human heart is, and the way that things have gone. The natural religion, which is everywhere, all cultures across the centuries have had some form of religious worship or devotion, and yet that has become futile and foolish and has gone astray without God's help, without God's word to guide them. Those invisible attributes corrupted in their understanding. I'm going to give you a chart with some notes about the ancient world and their ideas and thoughts about this question of sexuality, in particular homosexuality. And Israel over here on this end, Greece in the middle, and Rome, or the Romans, on this end over here. And remember that this is to whom Paul is writing. He's writing to these Romans about this topic. It's interesting, I think, that one of the things when you open up the Bible and you look for a topic that is so widely discussed right now in American society as sexual interest and homosexuality in particular, there are very few passages in the whole of the Bible on that topic. Very few. And I'm going to give you the ones that are most clearly about that. This is one that we're studying here in Romans. And there are a few from the Old Testament in Israel. The first is Genesis chapter 19. That's a story of Sodom and Gomorrah, which you'll recognize. And it talks about men there in that city expressing homosexual interest in other men there. Some other passages come up in the book of Leviticus. Leviticus 18:22 and 20 verse 13. Chapter 18 in Leviticus is a holiness code. And that 18th chapter is focused especially on the topic of sex. And it gives a whole long series of commandments related to that topic. And as you go over that, there's only one that comes up on the topic of homosexuality. The rest are all focused on heterosexual relationships. So these are important things, I think, to see about the message of the Bible and what the Bible focuses on. And the reason for that is because in Israel, homosexuality was not something that seems to have been encouraged or promoted. It does not seem to have been widely practiced, and so it doesn't become widely discussed. They spend much, much more time on the topic of adultery and fornication. Okay? Those are the ones that the Old Testament really focuses on and spends time on. But what it does say here is instructive and helpful. And if we were to look at that passage, it says that a man shall not lie with another man as with a woman, is what it says there. In other words, a man should not have sexual relations with a woman like he would, or excuse me, with a man as he would with a woman. Okay, it forbids that and calls it abomination, along with many other things in the chapter are called abomination. And there it's stuff like incestuous relationships, close family relationships, et cetera, et cetera. It goes into very great detail about all of those things. The commandment is repeated again in chapter 20, verse 13. It's basically the same content is given there. So there's a prohibition in the law of Moses against same-sex relationships, same-sex acts, okay? It says nothing about what might be going on inside of a person's mind. So for example, we know from having conversations with people who have same-sex interests and attractions that those are things they may experience in their mind, but what the scriptures forbid is carrying out the acts, okay, the acts of that sexuality. Let's see, another passage that comes up and is similar in many ways to this passage here, Judges chapter 19. And the men of, in the tribe of Benjamin, in particular the city of Gibeah, speak in a way similar to the men did here in Genesis 19. They ask to have people brought to them so they may have sex with them. And that is another passage. Israel responds very harshly to that situation. But that's really the points in the Old Testament where this is referred to or talked about. Otherwise, it's all about heterosexual relationships, okay? Because that's what's predominating in Israel. So that's a part of the reason you don't hear me getting up and preaching about this in the pulpit or teaching about it in Bible class, because honestly, it doesn't come up that often. And I try to focus on what I'm preaching and teaching on the scriptures. Okay, let's go on to talk about the setting in Greece. St. Paul is probably writing from Corinth when he's writing the book of Romans. He's in that culture, he's in that setting. He was raised in what they call Hellenistic culture, which is Greek-influenced culture himself, and where he was in Tarsus in Asia Minor. So he's very familiar with this culture and the way it works. And what's happening in Greece is quite different from what was going on in Israel. The Greeks practiced something called pederasty. Pederasty. And the ped part here refers not to ped as a foot, but to a child. And what would happen in Greek culture is they would pair up a man with a boy. And the man was to serve as a mentor to the boy, but they also were typically sexual partners. It was a sexual relationship. And this is, if you go back and read Greek literature, a lot of this comes out in the Greek literature and is discussed and described. If you were studying classics 50 years ago, it might not have been discussed very much. I imagine today when they have classes on classical literature, it's probably discussed very often. Has come up and become much more highlighted, these kinds of practices. The Spartans are famous for their military prowess. Big on this. Very big on this. Pairing up men with boys and assuming that there would be sexual relationships. That was, and I always cringe a little bit when I hear a school choose the name Sparta, because it sounds so, you know, great. They were great military. They really were. They were the shining military of their time, and yet they were deeply involved in this practice. a practice which is, in the United States, at least to this point, illegal. Right? You can't have sex with a minor in the United States. So when Paul is writing this letter at Corinth, this is the cultural setting. This is what's going on in the culture. And Corinth is kind of like, in Greek life, what San Francisco is to American life. Okay, it was a port city, and it was known for anything and everything. An expression they would use among the Greeks was, if you were going to corrupt somebody's morals, you would Corinthianize them. Okay, is how they would talk. Paul is writing in that context, in that situation. So it's a common matter in Greek life. Our word lesbian comes from the name of an island off the coast of Greece called, Lesbos, the island of Lesbos. And there was a poet there by the name of Sappho. This is a female poet, and she is famous for writing about woman-to-woman sexual relationships. That's what she is known for. Another thing I'll add up here is in the differences as we're thinking about Greek and Israelite culture is the Olympics. You may have come across this over the years, thinking about the Olympics. Today when we have the Olympics, everybody has their clothes on. Although some of those outfits are getting a little skimpy, aren't they? It's getting a little risque in what they do. But in ancient times, the men competing in the Olympic Games all competed in the nude.
No winter sports, I guess.
So there are on the sides of pottery that we have from that era, there is depictions of the men in Olympic competitions, and they are unclothed. So you see how very different the cultures are here, don't you? In Israel, man, you better stay covered, right? Oftentimes when it refers to someone being naked in the Bible, it means that they don't have their outer clothes on. They still would have their underwear on, so to speak. But they would not be fully undressed. That's how difference in modesty in Israel would have been. Whereas the Greeks, let it all hang out. That was the culture. So Paul is writing from this culture. He's raised in this culture as an Israelite and as a rabbi, but he's writing from this culture and is very familiar with it. The last culture I'm going to describe to you is the Roman culture. And the Roman culture is different from both of these. Roman culture functions differently. They're influenced somewhat by Greek culture. A lot of the aspects of Greek culture and philosophy and all of those things are adopted by the Romans, and yet the Romans had a different way of doing things and seeing things. They are more of a military-focused culture. They're intent on expanding their military and expanding their empire. These are the thoughts that's going through a Roman's mind. And so they focus on masculinity. Our word virile comes from this view of the Romans. Vir is the word for man in Latin, and virile is talking about manly power. Okay, this is very much important to the Romans and their worldview and their thinking, and then that translates into issues of sex. Okay, And for the Romans, a feature of their sexuality is domination of the sex partner. That is something that they would have considered virile and manly to do. And for the most of these Romans, that's going to be male and female relationships. But there are instances in discussion of man-to-man type of relationships. And there, the person who is regarded as homosexual is not the dominating person, but the person who is submissive. And this still is to some extent appearing in other parts of the world influenced by Romance culture. I'm told that in Spanish culture and parts of that culture that has spread, that way of thinking and looking at things is still very much present in the culture. The word we use in English, it's not an English word, but the word we use to describe this sort of thing is macho or machismo. Okay? This way of thinking and seeing sexuality in that culture. So Paul is writing from this, the Holy Scriptures. He's writing in this situation, and he's writing here to these Romans, okay, who have different things going on. So I wanted you to have all of that in front of you as we now read. It's just 2 verses that talk about the topic of homosexual behavior. Okay? So now, would someone read for us verses 24 and... Excuse me, we're not quite there yet. Someone read verses 24 and 25 for us first. I'll comment on that, and then we'll get to the verses I'm talking about. 24 and 25, if someone would read.
Therefore God gave them up in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. Okay,
so bear in mind that Paul has been talking about general unrighteousness to this point, and how original sin contributes to that general unrighteousness. So when you see there in verse 24, therefore God gave them up to the lusts of their heart to impurity, don't think just of homosexuality acts. Think of more broadly than that. Okay? It's going to be whatever sins might be committed in that way across the spectrum of human life. So in Israel, that's going to be especially about sins like adultery and things of that nature, which is the big issue, adultery and fornication. Over here in Rome, it's going to be about the way that the men are treating their partners and the corruption that goes along with those lusts. Let's see. To the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshipped and served the Creator, or the creature, rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. So, Paul is saying that this fall into idolatry that has happened illustrates also the fallen mind and the way it manifests itself in its lusts or passions. Okay? The problem of the corruption of the human heart and mind. Now let's read those 2 verses I was talking about on this topic about homosexual passion. Someone read for us verses 26 and 27.
For this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions, for their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature. And the men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error.
Okay, so I'm going to switch back to the other side of the board. So we can look more specifically at how Paul is talking about this. So I started out writing about, and Paul's conversation started out talking about the natural knowledge of God. How we know God from looking at His creation and the way the creation is ordered and built and put together. And now in verse 26, he says, for this reason God gave them up to dishonorable passions. Okay? For their women exchanged, he says, natural relations for those that are contrary to nature. Let's talk about what Paul is saying with these two things. When he's talking about natural relations, he's talking about the original created design that God made. And if you go back to Eden and the early chapters of Genesis, it's talking about God creating one man and one woman. And that as the foundation of family and marriage and all of those things. And that would be that natural relations that Paul is referring to here. The natural order God put into human beings. You don't have to be a Christian to see this. If you ask a biologist, why do men have penises and women have vaginas? If you ask that question, the biologist is going to say, well, so that they can have babies. That's the natural use of those parts of the body as God created them. This is what Paul is thinking about. And what he's saying is, because of the corruption of sin and unrighteousness, that original sin, people gave up this natural use of the body for things that were contrary to nature. Contrary to nature. And once again, homosexuality would be just one part of that. There would be many other things that you could go on to talk about. Read Leviticus 18 if you want a list of all the things you could get into. But I think Paul is choosing this particular expression of human passion and sexuality because of where he's writing from. He's writing in Corinth, where this is commonly practiced and rampant, and in a form that we won't even allow. America is about the freest country on the globe, but we won't even allow this. We recognize this is morally wrong and dangerous. But in Greece, they were doing all of this. So Paul is writing in that context, and he's writing to people who would look at that and say, yeah, those Greeks shouldn't be doing that. The Romans would identify with that and say, yeah, that's we can see how that's contrary to the use of those parts of the body and the creation. So that's I think what Paul is up to and why he brings this in as an example. Now, when some people teach on this topic, what they'll do is they'll say, Paul brings in the issue of homosexuality because it's the worst sin. And I'm saying to you, that's not why he's doing this. Okay? if we think in terms of human relationships, the worst sins that we can think of would be things like murder and rape, right? Those even more destructive practices. He's going to make a comment about male homosexuality and a destructive outcome from it, though. Here, we'll see in a moment. This we should not think of homosexuality as the worst of the social sins that people might engage in. There are worse ones, okay? Murder being at the top of the list. At the same time, Paul is telling us this is not God's design. This is not what God created our bodies for. And so he's telling us it is a manifestation of sin and unrighteousness. And he would point us back to Genesis and the order that God established there. Let's see. So, their women exchanged natural relations for those contrary to nature, and the men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another. And Greek culture and literature is probably the biggest expression of this from the ancient world, as I've described it. Men committed shameless acts with men and received in themselves the due penalty for their error. Okay? One of the things that has commonly happened with male homosexual practice in the ancient world and in modern times is the practice results in injury to the body and exchange of illnesses. And I think that's what Paul is referring to here when he talks about receiving in themselves the due penalty of their error. By committing these acts, they're harming one another in the things that they do. We might add to that as we think about this problem in Greek life and as it would illegally manifest itself in American life. When children are young, they are not thinking about sex. They're aware of it in that they recognize some people are male and others are female. They catch up on that pretty quick. But they're not thinking about sexual relations and sexual relationships. And that's why it's such a dangerous thing when an adult gets involved and misleads a child into that way of life. We know that for the children who experience this, it is traumatic. In other words, it bends their minds. It hurts them in their minds and causes considerable harm. This is why it's remained illegal in American life. There is a group out there that's trying to lower the age limit, those ages related to sexuality, but they're not gaining ground. I think most Americans would see the dangers involved in that. We've had terrible cases, haven't we? You think of the abuse scandals that have happened in our Roman Catholic churches and the dangers that have come from that. But it's not just in the Roman Catholic Church, is it? It's also happened in, well, right up here at Ohio State, there's been issues. Penn State had this issue. Coach relationships with young people, that's a dangerous setting because they go into things like locker rooms. Okay? Those become dangerous settings for the young people. And St. Paul is writing and he's thinking about all of these issues of giving up the natural relations for those contrary to nature and the dangers that result. So I think that's why Paul brings this into the discussion with the Romans, because it is in the culture in which he's writing, and it's also somewhat in that Roman culture. And he's pointing to it as a very clear example of how people are living and doing contrary to nature. Okay, they're giving up the natural functions of the body for ones that they really weren't designed for. And this is God's concern, isn't it? The Creator wants us to use our bodies and our lives the way He designed them. And this is where family comes from, isn't it? You can't have family. Well, we're trying to do it with test tubes these days, and introducing all kinds of things. But God would point us to those natural relationships and natural resulting family, and how that is His design. That is what He wanted to see happen. So there we go. Let's have somebody now read and watch how Paul, he's gone in and focused on this issue because it illustrates what is contrary to nature. But watch him pull back and what he focuses on and talks about next. Someone read for us verse 28.
And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done.
Okay, and they here is humanity generally. Okay? It's not just the people he's mentioned in those last two verses. And we'll see that as we read on. Someone read for us verses 29 and 30.
They were filled with all manner of unrighteousness, evil, covetousness, malice. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents.
Let's add verse 31.
Foolish, faithless, heartless, and ruthless.
Okay, you see how he's drawn in on the topic of sexual acts as an illustration of what's contrary to nature, and yet now he's pulling out, isn't he? He's pulling way back and he's pointing to everybody in Rome and Greece and Israel and saying we are all corrupted by our sin. I look at that list of things that he gives there in verses 30 and 31, well, going back to 29, 30, and 31, and I look at that and I see it's things I've done wrong. I didn't always obey my parents as I ought to have done. Sure, I've had issues with envy before. I've probably slandered a few people over the years. Probably said things that I shouldn't do. Boastful? Yeah, that's an easy one to drop into, isn't it? So this is important to see. Paul speaks against homosexual acts in that way, but he's doing it also in the context of the broader problems of unrighteousness and sin. And as we talk about this and think about this as a congregation and as individuals, we need to keep that in perspective in the way that we care for other people around us, and not overlook the struggles we ourselves face. Verse 32, someone read for that, and that gets us through the end of the section.
Knowing the judgment of God, that they which commit such things are worthy of death, not only do the same, but have pleasure in them that do them.
Okay, so once again, this is a statement about the broad problem of humanity and not the particular problems discussed there in verses 26 and 27. So this is with all of this stuff in the news these days, becomes a challenge to us because we might want to react and possibly overreact against people who are facing this question in their own minds about their sexuality and their sexual interests, and how that affects their relationship to God and to one another. Okay? So keeping all of this in a broader perspective is what I was hoping to achieve here. Does God want people to live in homosexual relationships? I would say no, based on what St. Paul describes here. But there are a lot of other relationships that God is forbidding and discouraging in this whole thing. And we need to keep all of that in perspective as we go. I'm going to talk briefly, we've got just a few more minutes, I'm going to talk briefly about the question of why some people have homosexual interests in their sexuality and most do not. Okay? There's a big discussion that continues to go on in the world of psychology about this issue. And it swings back and forth. In the 1970s, homosexual behavior was classified as a mental illness. And the arguments that people who were homosexual brought to my attention as a youth growing up, as I talked with people, and I knew people who had homosexual interests. The thing that they would say is, I was born that way. The pendulum has swung, and that is not so much the emphasis these days. The emphasis now tends to be on, I choose this as a lifestyle. You hear that lifestyle language has become common. There's in the research, they have looked and looked and looked for what they call the gay gene, to try to find something that would demonstrate that a person is born that way, and they have not found it. To this day, I did some reading just this week about that topic, and they're still saying that the research is absolutely unclear as to why that happens in people. There's some other correlations, though, that are coming out in human relationships, and they're controversial in discussion of them. So on the one hand, there's the born that way argument that is now tends to be falling out of favor. And then on the other hand is, I choose that. I choose to be that way and to see things that way. And that tends to be on the upswing these days. In the middle, the researchers are finding this. Issues of anxiety and depression. People who find themselves having homosexual interests and behaviors are often also having these. And once again, what the research is saying about this is split. There are those who would say, well, they're having this because everybody's looking down on them. That's what they're saying. I read an article in Psychology Today, and that was the argument from that author. And then I searched a little bit more, and I read another article in Psychology Today, and that researcher was saying that there's a chicken and egg problem here. Maybe they're turning to these different lifestyles or approaches to sexuality because they are struggling with anxiety and depression. And maybe it's not just because some people speak against them or look down on them. So that's a part of what's going on in the research right now. And depending on your viewpoint, people are lining up on either side of that idea. I'll tell you something that I have personally witnessed as I have been in conversations and counseling with people who have homosexual interests. Once again, in between these two poles, I find that persistently these issues come up. That the person has at some time in their life been abused in a sexual way, or they have been exploited. So I mentioned a little bit ago the issue of coaches in the locker room with the kids when they're going to the shower and stuff like that. They have gotten involved in these bad coaches. Now there are wonderful coaches out there, many good coaches, but there are some bad coaches who've gone in there and found opportunity to exploit them. And guess what? After those kids are exploited that way, they tend to have enduring homosexual interests. Okay? They're affected by the trauma of the experience. As I have talked with folks over the years, this I see happening again and again. I'll give you a particular example. I was dialoguing with a young man on a forum, and he was being very vocal about his homosexuality, and I was asking him questions about when did you notice this in your own life, that you had this as an interest and an orientation. And I asked him about, has there ever been issues of abuse in your life? And he said, no. Nothing like that ever happened to me. You know, that's not what's going on here. And then I asked him, how early did this start in your life? And then he didn't want to talk about it anymore. I think what happened was he experienced exploitation as a youth that pushed him in that direction, and there was nothing that pulled him back. It is how he viewed himself. Happened when he was underage, as I remember from that dialogue. I'm saying this for this reason, folks. We run into people who are wrestling with this question in their minds and their hearts. There are reasons for us to be thoughtful and compassionate about them, okay? Don't jump down their throats with you're evil or something like that. But to see that they are people who have been probably affected in their lives by other issues. And that should be a cause of compassion for us as God's people as we work with them. Now, does that mean that we start doing the gay weddings and all of that stuff here at Emmanuel? No, it's in our Constitution. We won't do that. Okay? But we can show God's grace and compassion to folks who are struggling with this sort of thing. That's the presentation I wanted to give to you today.